Everything begins to feel slightly unstable. The signals you used to rely on disappear. The emotional intensity drops. The urgency fades. And strangely, the process starts to feel quiet. Not exciting, not dramatic, just quiet. And that quietness triggers something uncomfortable, because your mind immediately assumes something must be wrong. You start wondering if the momentum disappeared, if you lost the alignment, if you somehow interrupted the process, and almost automatically, a subtle impulse appears. The impulse to fix something, to analyze again, to revisit the method, to adjust the process, to intervene. But the invisible mistake happening in this moment is subtle. You are interpreting stabilization as failure. And because the shift doesn't look dramatic, you assume it needs correction. You try to fix the very moment that signals the breakthrough is approaching. Let's break down what your nervous system is actually doing. When manifestation begins moving from intention into stabilization, your nervous system enters a recalibration phase. Most people assume manifestation is an emotional surge, but biologically, it behaves very differently. The nervous system isn't designed to maintain constant emotional intensity. It is designed to stabilize patterns, which means that right before a major shift occurs, the system often becomes quieter rather than louder. This follows what I call the neural stabilization framework. The predictable phases your nervous system moves through during identity change. In the early stages, emotional energy dominates. You feel motivation, you feel excitement, you feel anticipation. But those emotions are not the final signal. They are simply the activation phase. The deeper transformation begins when emotional intensity starts to fade and neural stabilization begins. But there is a moment most people completely misinterpret. A moment where the system becomes almost neutral, and neutrality feels unfamiliar. So the mind assumes the process stopped. In reality, something very different is happening. Your brain is a prediction engine. Every moment, it attempts to predict what will happen next based on past patterns. These predictions create what neuroscientists call internal models of reality. Your identity is essentially one of those models. It is a predictive map your brain uses to navigate the world. When manifestation begins changing your identity structure, those predictive maps start losing accuracy. Your brain receives new data that no longer fits the old model. This creates something called a prediction error. Prediction errors are not problems. They are signals that learning and restructuring are occurring. But your nervous system interprets prediction errors as uncertainty. And uncertainty activates a stabilization response. The brain attempts to restore predictability. And this is where most people unknowingly sabotage the process. Instead of allowing the new pattern to stabilize, they try to force the system back into something familiar. They analyze, they adjust, they fix. But by doing that, they reactivate the old predictive model. They reinstall the identity pattern that was dissolving. The observer effect offers a useful metaphor here. In quantum mechanics, observing a system can influence the outcome. The act of measurement collapses possibilities into a defined state. Something similar happens psychologically. When you constantly check the process, you are measuring it through the identity that still expects uncertainty. Your attention becomes an interference pattern. You keep collapsing the process back into the old identity framework. Not intentionally, but neurologically. You measure, you analyze, you fix. And every attempt to fix reminds the nervous system that the old identity is still active. So the system returns to that pattern. Have you noticed this silence lately? The sudden lack of emotional intensity, the absence of obvious movement, the feeling that everything paused. This silence makes people uncomfortable because silence feels like nothing is happening. But in many cases, silence is stabilization. When a system shifts identity patterns, it briefly enters what could be called a threshold state. You are no longer fully operating from the previous identity, but the new identity hasn't fully stabilized yet. This creates a psychological neutral zone. It feels like nothing, but internally, neural networks are reorganizing. Synaptic patterns are recalibrating. Predictive models are adjusting. Your brain is learning how to operate from a different identity configuration. And this process requires minimal interference. But the mind dislikes neutral zones. The ego prefers activity, movement, problems, solutions. So it generates something that appears logical. It tells you, maybe I should review the method again. Maybe I should visualize more. Maybe I should change strategies. Maybe I missed something. Maybe I need to fix something. This logic sounds reasonable, but neurologically, it is a stabilization reflex. The brain attempting to restore familiarity. Because identity change always creates temporary uncertainty, and uncertainty activates corrective behavior. But correction in this moment interrupts stabilization. Self-sabotage rarely feels like sabotage. Most of the time, it feels responsible. It feels productive. It feels intelligent. But right before a breakthrough, the system often requires the opposite: non-interference. Because the neural pattern is already restructuring. Imagine tuning a radio between stations. There is a brief moment of static. If you immediately turn the dial back to the previous station, you never reach the new frequency. That static moment is the transition. Identity change works the same way. The static is not failure, it is recalibration. Another misunderstanding appears at this stage. People assume breakthroughs should feel exciting, but high excitement is often instability. Excitement activates sympathetic nervous system activity, which means heightened alertness. But long-term identity stabilization requires regulation, calm, neutrality, consistency. So when the nervous system begins stabilizing around the new pattern, emotional intensity decreases, and the experience feels quieter than expected. This quiet stability is often the real signal that the shift is consolidating. But because people expect fireworks, they assume the process stopped. Your internal state during this phase often feels strangely ordinary. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just subtle calm. But calm can be deceptive, because calm means the nervous system no longer perceives threat or instability around the desired outcome. The system begins integrating the new identity pattern as normal, which is exactly what manifestation requires. Not emotional intensity, but identity normalization. At this stage, the most effective action is surprisingly simple: do less, not more. Every intervention introduces noise into the system. Every attempt to control reactivates the old identity. Every correction reminds the nervous system that the new state is not yet trusted, which slows stabilization. The minimal integration principle suggests that the less you interfere during stabilization, the faster the system integrates the new pattern. Intervention delays consolidation. Stillness accelerates it. This usually happens after resistance collapses, the moment when you stop forcing the process. Stop analyzing every signal. Stop trying to fix the timeline. Resistance disappears, and the nervous system shifts from effort into regulation. At that point, manifestation stops being something you chase and becomes something your identity naturally supports. So what should you actually do during this phase? Very little. Stop reacting. Stop measuring. Stop adjusting the process. Let the nervous system stabilize. Let the neural pattern integrate. Let the new identity organize itself. Breakthroughs rarely arrive during emotional intensity. They arrive during stabilization, when the system stops resisting the new configuration. If you are currently experiencing this quiet phase, there is a good chance you are closer to the shift than you realize, but only if you allow the stabilization process to complete. If you're in this phase, comment "stabilizing." And this is only one phase inside the neural stabilization framework. If this perspective expands your awareness, subscribe so you don't interrupt the next shift. The silence was recalibration.